Up next, it's a rally held Tuesday at the U.S. Capitol building. A number of members of Congress and Chinese dissidents met on the occasion of the second anniversary of the Tiananmen Square demonstration to express their opposition to extending most favored nation trading status for China without attaching any preconditions that would require an improved human rights record by the government there. Last week, the president expressed his wish to extend the most favored nation status, giving China lower tariffs on its exports to the U.S. The president spoke with 13 senators Tuesday about his position on the MFN policy. A number of legislators have argued that the government of China has done nothing in the way of human rights reform since the Tiananmen Square incident, and they've said granting MFN would send a message of acceptance of human rights abuses there. Next, you'll hear from several members of Congress and representatives of the Independent Federation of Chinese Scholars and Students, the Foundation for Democracy in China, Amnesty International, Asia Watch, and other Chinese organizations.
Today is June 4th. 2 years ago, the massacre on Tiananmen Square awakened the Chinese people.
One of those mics is speaking mic, but that's it. No, this one. Is it on? That's it.
It's on. Okay. You might introduce yourself too.
Okay. My name is Xiaochuan Zhang, Executive Director of Independent Federation of Chinese Student Scholars, and Professor Feinerman is a professor at Georgetown Law School, and we're happy to serve the MC today for the rally. And we gathered here today to commemorate the second anniversary of June 4th. The event that awakened the Chinese people and the thousands of Chinese students in the United States and around the world. And let me introduce our first speaker today, Mr. Lilu, who was the Deputy Commander on Tiananmen Square and currently a student at Columbia University. Been a long time, well, 2 years to say the least, activist on human rights. And it's my honor to present Mr. Lilu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Today, we people who live salute those who give their lives for freedom and democracy, those whose souls and spirit, I believe now, reside in heaven. We dare not forget them for a single moment, nor dare we stop our struggle for a single day. How can we rest when Wang Dan, Ren Wanding, Han Dongfang, and thousands of political prisoners still sit behind bars? How can we forget when the blood on Tiananmen Square is not yet dry? The young man who stood briefly in front of that columns of tanks is still listed as missing by Chinese government. Dare we forget his courage? In the 2 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre, little has improved in mainland China. Instead, the oppressive policies has become worsened. Innocent people continue to be arrested and sentenced. This is the most difficult time for us, for our democracy movement, and for the millions of Chinese who in the spring of 1989 so courageously upheld the hope for a better China. And yet, every year around this time, we have hope. We know that Congress and the United States government are now in the process of deciding whether to grant China a continuation of its MFN status. MFN in the past 2 years has proved the most effective tool to pressure Chinese government to improve its human rights record. Last year, as the United States government debated whether to renew China's MFN status, several hundred of political prisoners were released, and yet thousands more remained behind bars, desperately waiting for us who now enjoy freedom to take any possible action to alleviate their plight. The voices raised by millions of peaceful demonstrators in 1989 were answered by tanks and troops. A totalitarianism regime like Beijing government will only respond to pressure. I believe restoring China's MFN status with human rights conditions attached is the best way we can help those freedom fighters. So here, allow me to use this special occasion to thank Senator Josh Mitchell, Senator Ted Kennedy, Congressman John Porter, Tom Lantos, John Miller, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, and many others. Thank you all for holding the issue of Chinese human rights abuses visually before the American public and Congress. Thank you for what you have done for Chinese people. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, President Bush prefers an unconditional renewal of MFN. It is, as President Bush has stated, immoral to close China's door. I myself belong to the generation who benefited the most from 10-year open door policy. So I cannot agree more with President Bush in keep China open. It is a moral act to keep China open. But I think it is also equally deep moral act to pressure Chinese government to release the political prisoners, as many as possible, as soon as possible. The President is right in his desire to support the reform element within the communist government. But the thousands of political prisoners who constitute and will continue to constitute the main body of the democratic movement will at least deserve the same sympathy and the support from the United States government. I here plea for the American public, Congressman and woman, President of the United States, please help us in our cause to free all the political prisoners, to restore human dignity and bring democracy for China. For the fact remains that a democratic movement cannot survive if all its leaders languish in prison, nor can a society progress if freedom is so seriously curtailed. So please help us in our fight to secure the basic right for the Chinese people, the right to life, to liberty, to express themselves, and to be free from torturers and executioners. And I believe with your help and encouragement that the day will soon come when China will be free. Thank you. Now allow me to use this special occasion to express my feelings in Chinese. Because 2 days before, I was in the middle of the Tiananmen Square with 5,000 of others sitting peacefully when the troops surrounded Tiananmen Square, when the tanks crushed thousands of people and injured tens of thousands of people. I would like to use this occasion also say something to my dearest colleagues and my people in China. 同胞们、女士们、先生们，6·4对于千百万亲身参与者，对于我们每一个中国人来说，都不是一个平常的日子。它是用一切诸如悲痛、哀伤等一切人类语言所无法涵盖的感情。它是一座中华民族的丰碑，在它的上面高高擎起的是民主、自由、尊严的旗帜，在它的身体上染上的却是斑斑的血迹。6·4也是一个在东方大陆上猖獗了数十年的猛兽的临死前的最后的狂喊。当他张开血盆大嘴，去又一次扼杀了中华民族千载难逢的历史性腾飞机会的时候，他也宣布了自己的灭亡。亲爱的，我的国内的朋友们、同学们，敬爱的北京市民们，我真诚的想念你们。夜半多凉，勿当保重。但是请相信我一句话，中华民族又一次到了历史的十字路口，任这些逆历史潮流而动的小丑们猖獗的时候已经不长了。对于和我一起出生、一起长大、共同接受了那场伟大运动的洗礼和考验的年轻的一代人，我想引用中国著名诗人顾城的一句诗来共慰：黑夜给了我们黑色的眼睛，但我们注定要用它去寻找光明。谢谢大家。
As we gather today to commemorate the second anniversary of the tragedy in Beijing, which culminated a period of martial law following the pro-democracy demonstrations, I think it's important to keep in mind that the dress rehearsal for that tragedy had begun months earlier in the autonomous region, so-called, of Tibet, where both martial law and the demonstrations occurred and provided a kind of experience before the fact, both for the Chinese military and for the people who are subject to their depredations. Our next speaker, Lodi Gyari, President of the International Campaign for Tibet, will speak to us about that situation.
I'm here today joining my Chinese friends because I believe a democratic China is the key to free Tibet. What had happened in Tiananmen Square was very tragic, but I believe it was also a great eye-opener for the rest of the world, eye-opener for the people of China, and also for us Tibetans. For the world, because for the first time you saw the real feelings of the Chinese people. And for the Chinese, because for the first time I think our Chinese friends have realized what brutal suppressions their own government was conducting in Tibet. They did not believe it, unfortunately, until it happened to them in Tiananmen Square. For us Tibetans, it was great eye-opening because after 40 years of misrule, we have come to mistrust every Chinese. And if I may say so, dislike every Chinese. But when I saw on the television the feelings of the Chinese people, their capability to cry, their capability to be loved, their desire for freedom and democracy, it also was eye-opener for us, because we felt, yes, the Chinese people have feelings just as we have. It is only a handful of people and the leadership that has no heart. So that most tragic thing that had happened also, in my opinion, had a positive aspect. But unfortunately, it seems there are still people today whose eyes have not totally been opened. And if I may say so, though I do not wish to, keeping with our tradition, mistreat the hospitality, but I think President George Bush also needs to open his eyes a little more wider to the realities of China. If the American people and the government seeks the friendship of Chinese people, the billion Chinese people, then they should act differently. And I do certainly feel that, as one of my Chinese friends said earlier, at least strong conditioning of the most favored nation status is the key thing to bring about change in China. Giving unconditionally will send definitely the wrong signal. That, I think, the Chinese friends and the Tibetans know much more than the Western experts and the bureaucrats who sit in the State Department. The other day, Professor Fang Lezi spoke at a hearing conducted here at the Congress, and some other former bureaucrats also spoke. But the most important for the American people and leadership in the Congress is listen to the Chinese future leadership, and not to the self-styled China specialists. But I was quite surprised. I was there at that hearing, and there were some former bureaucrats who were saying that the MFN should be given unconditionally. But then he himself says, "Oh, Mr. Chairman, I recall that when MFN was first given to China, there were two specific conditions," he says. One was the Sino-Soviet relation, that China should not become friendly with the Russians, and second, should not invade Taiwan. So the fact is that it's a hypocrisy. From the beginning it was conditional. He himself, the man who said it should be given unconditionally, says very proudly it was conditioned. And I think it was very bad condition. You are actually saying that, okay, I give you this, which is actually supposed to be for bilateral friendship, if you don't become friends with the Russians. So I was really shocked and also quite surprised. But anyway, I will not take much of your time, but I also would like to take this opportunity to once again thank the great leadership in the American Congress, both in the Senate and the House, who have been bold enough to speak out for the people of Tibet. In fact, I think, as my predecessor just mentioned, not only what had happened in Tiananmen Square was rehearsed, what happened in Tibet was rehearsal for what happened in Tiananmen Square, but also I think here in the Congress, the leadership in the Congress speaking for Tibetan freedom was also a great rehearsal, so that when the Chinese pro-democracy movement came out, you already had friends here, the friends of Tibet. All these great leaders who stand with you today are those who had been at the forefront. We have here Congressman Lantos and Porter. The two men, key persons who had been spearheading the Tibet movement, are also today there to help you. So I think we must cooperate together. We have a different agenda. Yours is for freedom and democracy. Ours is more than that. Ours is for freedom of Tibet. But there are many areas we can cooperate with each other, as we have been doing in the past. So let us fight together for freedom, for democracy, and for freedom of Tibet together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before our next speaker takes the podium, I just want to point out that there is a proclamation along with a letter, the text of which you see here, that is being distributed and will be sent, of course, to the leadership in China. And I will read out the text of that in just a moment. But I think it's important to understand the extent of both the human rights problem that still exists in China today, as well as the concern that we are expressing by this gathering. The scroll contains on it the names of 1,100 individuals who have been arrested following the June 1989 crackdown. These names were compiled by Asia Watch, relying on both official and unofficial sources. The scroll with all the names on it is 50 yards long, that's the length of half a football field, and contains a cross-section both of students and intellectuals, workers and peasants, others alleged to be agents for Taiwan, Tibetan activists, Catholic and Protestant religious believers, and democracy wall activists who we must remember, even thinking about the events 2 years ago, who have been in jail, many of them for almost 10 or 12 years. We have no accurate count of all the numbers of people who are detained in China today, but Amnesty International, Asia Watch, and others know that thousands of workers, students, and others remain imprisoned in China. We're calling on the Chinese government to give us a full accounting of all of them, to tell us what their legal status is, to make sure that any of those who are detained and have never been charged or given a chance of trial receive that immediately, and that all of those who are detained for the peaceful expression of their political beliefs or their religious practice be immediately and unconditionally released. The scroll will be unrolled on the floor of the House by some of the members who are speaking to you here today, and we will invite the signature of all the members who speak here today and other members of Congress. The text of the proclamation reads as follows: June 4th, 1991. The Honorable Wan Li, Chairman, Standing Committee, National People's Congress, People's Republic of China. Dear Mr. Chairman, as members of Congress deeply concerned about the egregious human rights violations in China and Tibet, we call on the government of the People's Republic of China to release all peaceful prisoners of conscience. On this second anniversary of the bloody massacre of demonstrators at Tiananmen Square and in the streets of Beijing, we also ask that you report on the conditions of all who have been arrested in the ensuing crackdown and account for those whose names are listed below. It's my honor to introduce as our next speaker Congressman Tom Lantos of California. He is, as you know, one of the co-chairs of the House Human Rights Caucus, the conveners of today's gathering. Congressman Lantos.
We have stood on this spot demanding freedom for Nelson Mandela when that looked like a distant and unachievable dream. Nelson Mandela is free. He no longer is in prison, and he speaks and fights for the rights of all the people of South Africa. We stood here when the dictator Ceausescu was running Romania, and we spoke out for the suppressed Romanian people and all the ethnic minorities and all the religious groups. Ceausescu is no longer with us, and Romania haltingly and slowly is making its way into the family of democratic nations. We stood here calling for an end to the suppression of human rights in Stalinist Soviet Union. And today, the Soviet Union has gone miles in the direction of pluralism and openness, a free press, and the right to emigrate. We stood here calling for the destruction of the Berlin Wall, and that wall is no longer there. And now we stand here with our brothers and sisters in China and Tibet calling for their freedom, and they too shall prevail. With all due respect, Mr. President, you are dead wrong on China. You never placate the dictator. You could not placate, one can never placate, but one can never temporize with the Hitlers and the Stalins and the octogenarian leadership in command in China. One can only confront them and have them yield to the human spirit, which is exactly what is going to happen in China. Now, there are some who, for the temporary and fleeting benefit of trade, would sell their soul. But the soul of the American people is not for sale. The soul of the American people is with the people of China, all of the people of China, not the handful of dictators who run the show. It was just a year ago when, for the first time in 51 years, I had the opportunity of going to communist Albania, the strongest bastion of Stalinism on the face of this planet. And I told the Albanian communist leadership, far more suppressive than the Chinese communist leadership today, that their day of stepping aside is coming. That the tiny Albanian people, 3 million, are sick and tired of being under the yoke of tyranny, that they will have to live like all people do, freely. And today, Albania is about to enter the family of free European nations. This will happen on the mainland of China. We will all be there when statues will be erected in Beijing to the young men and women who gave their lives for freedom 2 years ago. We will be there when Chinese history books will write about the young man who stood alone in front of the tanks and said he is ready to sacrifice his life, as Patrick Henry was ready to sacrifice his to live in freedom. We were so proud of you, Mr. President, every time you spoke for freedom. When you spoke for freedom of suppressed people anywhere. Why don't you join us, Mr. President, and speak with us for freedom in China, for religious and cultural liberty in Tibet, for the opportunity of 1 billion people, 1 billion people, to live like human beings? We would welcome you joining us. But if you don't, Mr. President, we shall prevail nonetheless. You may veto a legislation with respect to most favored nation treatment 1 year, the next year, maybe the 3rd year. But I predict that the day will come when the commitment of the American people and the American Congress to freedom in Asia as well as in Europe will prevail. And the men and women now running this dictatorship will no longer rule Beijing. There will be a free press, there will be freedom of religion, there will be a multiplicity of political parties, and there will be an opportunity for this most talented of all people to develop their full potential. We hope that that day will come soon, but we are certain that the heroes of Tiananmen Square and the heroes of Lhasa will long be remembered by humanity, long after the dictators in Beijing will have been thrown into the dustbin of history.
We're going to have the members of Congress who are here now follow on Congressman Lantos, and the next member who will speak is the co-chair, along with Congressman Lantos, of the Human Rights Caucus, Representative John Porter of Illinois.
2 years ago, one of the most egregious crimes in all of human history was committed against the peaceful pro-democracy demonstrators in Beijing. Brutal images of innocent people being mowed down by tanks and machine guns were clearly shown on our television screens and will be forever etched on the minds of every American. But there too, as my colleague and co-chairman Tom Lantos said a moment ago, was a courageous student standing before and stopping a line of tanks, showing his commitment to human freedom and his bravery in doing so. And that commitment to democracy and human rights for all of the Chinese people remains alive and strong today. While it may be somewhat in exile, it cannot be destroyed by all the tanks and guns and government brutality anywhere in the world. I believe it will, in the not-too-distant future, be going home to China. So let the message be heard that the American people and their representatives in Congress continue to stand with the democracy movement, will continue to press through the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, through international forums, through a new radio-free China, through the withdrawal of trade privileges from China, through every contact we have with the Beijing government to move China toward a more open and democratic society. Until the privileges of freedom and respect for fundamental human rights are granted to each and every individual in China, our work, our cooperation with Fong Leger, with Lilu, with Liu Binyang, with Shen Tong, with all of the courageous leaders for freedom in China will be at the very, very top of our agenda. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Congressman Tom Weiss from New York.
It's not only a privilege, but it's an honor to be out here with all of you, commemorating the terrible massacre that took place, and also the tremendous, courageous effort of the young Chinese who stood up to untold brutality. In Beijing, university students commemorated Tiananmen Square with a bold protest. At the U.S. Capitol, we remember the massacre with this rally. All across the United States, the American people are expressing their outrage. But how did George Bush commemorate the brutal crackdown in China? When the pro-democracy demonstrators were rounded up, he sent General Scowcroft to toast the Chinese leaders. When political prisoners were tried and executed, the president waived the economic sanctions Congress had imposed. And as the anniversary of the massacre approached, he again named China a most favored nation. When will President Bush realize that human rights are more important than his relationship with those antique Chinese dictators? When will he begin to use the tools we have, such as special trade benefits, to pressure those Chinese dictators to release political prisoners? This is a matter which should have the unified effort of the President and the Congress. But we can promise President Bush that if he won't press for reforms in China, the Congress of the United States will certainly do so. We join together this afternoon to mourn the loss of thousands, to express our outrage at the continued detention of countless numbers, and to remember and recommit ourselves to their struggle for democracy and human rights in China. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Congressman David Skaggs of Colorado.
Thank you. I feel privileged to be a part of this ceremony and commemoration this afternoon. Although it is obscured behind the caucus banner, just look behind us at that magnificent building, the symbol of this great democracy and really a symbol of freedom and human rights around the world. Remember how a little more than 2 years ago, the soul of America and really the soul of the world was being stirred by the young men and women of China looking to this symbol, looking to the symbol of our Statue of Liberty embodied in their own goddess of democracy, citing the words of our Declaration of Independence. What could be more stirring to us as Americans than to see the grip on the imagination of the Chinese people that our ideals and values held at that time? 2 years ago, many of us were at this same place with the memories of that beautiful springtime in Beijing still fresh in our minds, but with the memory of its violent repression fresher still. Anniversaries like this are about remembering and also about having resolution on what we should do for the future. It would be tragedy enough if that dashing of the hopes for a new generation of freedom and democracy in China had occurred. It would be more tragic still if we were to forget. So we are here today to remember, to pledge that we will always remember, and that we will stand with our brothers and sisters for freedom in China and around the world. All free people are trustees for those who do not enjoy freedom, and that is why we are here. 2 years ago, many of us marched from this capital to the Chinese embassy. At that time, we at least were invited in to meet with the ambassador, to discuss our concerns about what had just happened in Beijing. This morning, a bipartisan delegation of the House of Representatives again went to the Chinese embassy. We asked for an appointment, and it was denied. We asked to deliver a letter. A second secretary of the embassy met us to report that he was not authorized to receive our letter of concern about human rights in China. What a sad commentary on the history of the last 2 years. We must see that it is reversed.
Our next speaker is Congressman Dick Swett of New Hampshire.
Friends, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be able to speak to you this morning about so serious and important a subject. I am here to commemorate a sad but important anniversary. 2 years ago in Tiananmen Square, on a dark day for human freedom, government troops of the People's Republic of China ruthlessly and bloodily put an end to an historic movement towards democracy that had been sweeping China at that time. Government troops with armored personnel carriers and tanks entered the square and massacred hundreds of unarmed citizens. These Chinese citizens had come to Tiananmen Square to lodge their protests with nonviolence. They did not call for their fellow countrymen to engage in violence. They simply asked for a chance to take part in shaping their country's future and destiny. The government did not stop the brutality here. It engaged in executions following the massacre and unleashed a wave of repression against pro-democracy activists across China and Tibet. Kangaroo courts meted out prison sentences. ranging from 10 to 20 years. And these same courts continue to mete out these kinds of sentences even as we speak. As we gather today, we cannot even be sure of the status of many of these victims of repression. The government's cruelty is matched by its secrecy. The case of Xiao Yuan, a staff member of Science and Technology Institute of the Central China Teachers University in Wuhan, was arrested on July 12, 1989, and was accused of helping to conceal wanted dissident Wang Juntao. He was reportedly indicted in January 1990, but he still had not been tried in late 1990. His present legal status and whereabouts remain totally unknown. My friends, what kind of a government is this that not only punishes people that work for peaceful change, but then tries to conceal its brutal repressions from the rest of the world? The Chinese government has gambled that the West will forget Tiananmen Square and the bloody events that followed. But our presence here today and the continuing clamor of our voices shows that we will not forget, and that we do care. We care about Xiao Yuan and his colleagues. We care about all of the fallen students. We care about those who cannot return. We care about those suffering today in the jail cells in the nation of China. Because we care, because we will not forget, we must insist on a higher standard than political expediency when making our judgment about most favored nation status to the People's Republic of China. Our policies must be consistent with our principles. We must send a clear signal to those who request our trade assistance. Why does this administration reward China's continued repression? Why does this administration reward a government that violates the human rights of its own people? For the sake of our own principles and values, and for the sake of the repressed victims of state-sponsored violence, we must not renew MFN for the butchers of Beijing. Let us commit ourselves to ensuring that such tragic atrocities of Tiananmen Square are never forgotten. Let our collective memory become a clear deterrence for those leaders who make a mockery of democracy. We must be certain that those who have fallen did not die in vain. Let us never give up our struggle for freedom for 1/5 of this world's population. Thank you very much.
The next member to speak will be Neil Abercrombie of Hawaii.
There's little that I can add to what has already been said. We've gone over all the statistics. We've gone over the dry legislation. We talk about most favored nation status and trade. These are statistics. These are abstractions. What remains for us to do is to keep the human dimension before us. It has already been cited that a young man stood in front of tanks and stopped them cold in their tracks. I'm not ashamed to say when I saw that, tears came to my eyes because I was reminded how we take freedom for granted. How easily the word rolls off our lips. How easy it is to cite our privileges and our rights in the United States of America. And it has been cited that we are trustees of freedom. And all good trustees must make absolutely sure that they conduct themselves on behalf of freedom. And so it's the obvious that we're here to state today. And it's the obvious that we're here to state because it's the obvious that you take most for granted and that you forget first. Because we enjoy the fruits of freedom, every man and woman on this podium who serves in the Congress has come from somewhere else in the world where they were seeking freedom, and their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers, their great-grandparents, They had a vision of freedom. They had a vision that they took with them, and we are the beneficiaries of it. And as the beneficiaries and the trustees, as the legacy of freedom has come down to us, it is our obligation, not just our privilege and our honor, but our obligation to see to it that whenever anyone is in a dark jail cell, when anyone, any place, is being tortured for the right to speak, as we're speaking here today, that we stand with them and never, ever, under any circumstances, for greed, for trade, take those rights and smash them down and join with the people who are oppressing the people who are trying to achieve their freedom. There can be no excuse for any of us in the United States Congress to put the abstractions of trade ahead of the reality of human freedom. There is a cry throughout China today, a cry throughout Tibet, a cry throughout the world, a full-throated cry of freedom that we have to respond to, that we have to defend, that we have to support. If it means doing it by way of legislation and treaty statuses with trade, by all means, let's do it. If it means backing up human rights advocates wherever they are in the world, then that by all means we have to do it. The fundamental point is this, that we must never, ever lose sight of the human dimension. When one young anonymous man can stand for all of us in front of the full might of the army that faced them in Tiananmen Square, it would be sacrilege for us to do anything else than honor that individual, honor what he represents by voting for freedom for China, standing for freedom for China. Long live China, long live freedom in China.
Our next speaker will be Congressman Stanley Hoyer from my residing state, state of Maryland.
Thank you very much. They talked about constructive engagement. And what they meant by constructive engagement was that we would have business as usual with South Africa. We passed a bill and they vetoed it. And the Congress stood up and said, no, it is not going to be business as usual with those who undermine the rights of human beings around the world. Whether those individuals reside in the United States, the Soviet Union, or South Africa. And now it is very clear that we must say with an equally strong voice that we will not temporize with those in China who undermine human rights in China. Ronald Reagan stood up and faced the world and said that the Soviet Union represented the evil empire. And by that he meant that they were not according the same level of rights that we in the civilized world felt were responsible and right to do. That in fact international norms and law demanded that that be done. It is now not time to temporize with those in China who undermine human rights. I am pleased to co-sponsor and will strongly support the Pelosi amendment, which will say that business as usual is contingent upon the recognition of rights in China, the recognition of certain basic international norms that we expect those with whom we do business to honor. That is their obligation. They sit on the Security Council of the United Nations. It is an obligation of those who subscribe to the Charter and to the Declaration of Human Rights to honor that which they have supposedly given support to. And so I'm pleased to join all my colleagues not only in signing this resolution, this scroll that I understand will be delivered to the leaders of China. As chairman of the Democratic Caucus, I was chairing the caucus and could not go to the embassy this morning
And we were talking about the Civil Rights Bill here in America, to make sure that every American is accorded the kind of rights, whether they be black or whether they be female or whether they be Chinese American or any other American, equal rights. We ought not to, when we do business with others around the world, do any less. Let me close for those of you who are here from China, those of you who are Chinese Americans, and those of you who may understand Chinese. I will perhaps garble this, but the feeling is very intense. Tsinghua Zensai Yao Zio. China wants freedom now. If we keep our voices strong, if we stay allied, and if we do not temporize when MFN comes up for China, we will ultimately, as we did with the Soviet Union, as we have in Eastern Europe, and is happening in South Africa, the tide for human rights will not be stemmed if we keep the faith. Freedom now in China.
Our next speaker will be Representative Jolene Unseld of the state of Washington.
Two years after Tiananmen Square, we've gathered to remember those who gave their lives for freedom. But we're also here to dedicate our hearts, our minds, and our spirits to those in China who still dream of freedom in a land where the people rule. They, and not a group of aged and frightened autocrats, represent China's future. Just last week, Fang Lizhu, a man whom we all respect for his wisdom and courage, offered a challenge to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He challenged those of us who live in a nation blessed with freedom to be true to our own principles. He stated, "The United States of America is a country that is dedicated to the founding principles of human rights and rule of law. The reason why America is respected by many Chinese is that some of its actions accord with these principles." He's right to say pointedly that only some of our actions are consistent with our founding principles. We do not live up to those principles when we feign shock at the brutality of Tiananmen and then send secret envoys to kowtow to Beijing's tyrants. We are not consistent when we claim to be concerned with national sovereignty, but fail to condemn the brutality of China's long occupation and suppression of Tibet. The time has come for us to put an end to this "you're okay, we're okay" charade with a government that shows no regard for the best and most noble aspirations of its own people. The time has come for us to stand with those who are jailed and with those who are still risking everything to lift the torch of freedom. I'm proud to join with you.
Our next speaker will be Representative Ben Gilman of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend all of you who've taken the time to join in this protest, in this rally, in this demonstration of our feelings about human rights. And we in the Human Rights Caucus in Congress have expressed ourselves very strongly over the days and months preceding this rally with regard to China's oppression and violation of human rights. There's a long-standing myth that in order to bring about positive economic change and political change in the PRC that we have to continue to grant it MFN and simply wait for the older men who are still ruling Beijing to fade away from the scene. And if we deny PRC MFN, it's argued, China will happily withdraw into its own cocoon, and we're going to hurt progressive elements in a ruling elite in addition to losing all of our influence with that nation. Well, the truth is that by kowtowing to its oppressive leaders, young and old, we've already isolated them from the ethical and moral standards that we expect of a nation that enjoys a huge trade imbalance, an imbalance with us, and continues to ruthlessly occupy Tibet. Years of moral and ethical isolation has emboldened China's communist leaders. According to Amnesty International, pro-democracy forces in the PRC have been hunted down, they've been rounded up, and they've even been executed. Asia Watch calls China's rule over Tibet merciless repression, and Freedom House informs us that Tibet is the number one worst area in the world in regards to political freedom. The reauthorization of MFN has not put a stop to any of this. According to authoritative sources, the authorities in Beijing have re-centralized their banking, their credit, production, planning, material allocation, foreign trade, and other important elements in their economy. Approximately 3 million private and semi-private Chinese enterprises have been shut down, and in the majority of the cases, only state-run enterprises are going to benefit from MFN. All of this has happened since the reauthorization of MFN after Tiananmen Square massacre some 2 years ago. We denied MFN to the Eastern Bloc, we denied it to South Africa and to Nicaragua, and it worked. A country that exports kidneys of executed political prisoners, exports prisoners to Africa to work on roads for Chinese government contracts, exports products made by political prisoners, denies all form of democratic expression, and unveiled last week a 230-foot-tall monument in downtown Lhasa to commemorate its rule over Tibet, deserves the same treatment. It will not withdraw into its cocoon. The pre-industrialized China of the 1960s no longer exists. The trouble today with the PRC is not the old communists in Beijing. There are plenty of young ones willing to take their place. The trouble with China today is the communist system itself and the world's industrialized nations willing to bankroll it. For that reason, I'm pleased to have signed this declaration of our feelings with regard to their violations of human rights, and commend all of you for joining with us in that endeavor. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Representative Tom Andrews from Maine.
It is indeed an honor to be here this afternoon. A Chinese proverb reads, "One picture is worth 1,000 words." Well, we've heard 1,000 words here in Washington. Why we must relate to the rulers of China as if nothing at all happened in Tiananmen Square 2 years ago. Why the government of China should be considered most favored. Why freedom, why democracy, and why human rights will have to wait. But the pictures of Tiananmen Square erase these words. Thousands of brave students singing late at night in a public square. A statue of liberty. A solitary man standing in front of a row of tanks which are backing down. Blood, human blood, on the square. These pictures cannot and will not be erased. They speak of a truth that cannot and will not be ignored. Today, as we Americans recognize this truth and remember those pictures, we are forced to confront ourselves. Who are we? As Americans, what do we stand for? What is the moral backbone of this nation? What is the foundation on which our relations with the rest of the world will stand? We stood firm against the brutal aggression and occupation on the desert sands of the Middle East. But we turn our backs on the brutal aggression and oppression in Tiananmen Square. We raise our voices, and indeed our swords, against the occupation and brutalization of Kuwaitis. But we turn our backs on the occupation and brutalization of Tibetans. Americans believe in justice. Americans believe in human rights. Americans believe in democracy. We must stand for these principles and stand up for those who are so brutally denied them, whether oil flows beneath their feet or not. An ancient Chinese poet, Lilu, once wrote, "So many sorrows. And last night in my dream, chariots like a running stream, so many. But there is a moon of flowers in the spring winds. The winds of change are blowing. The flowers of freedom will blossom. China will be free." Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Representative Donald Payne of New Jersey.
Thank you very much. Today we gather as members of the Human Rights Caucus and as concerned American citizens to mark a tragic anniversary. It was 2 years ago that the government of China used tanks and guns to crush the hopes of their own young people yearning for a better life. As believers in freedom and democracy, we are here to send a message to our brave young friends in China that they are not forgotten. 1 month from today, as Americans, we will hold our traditional 4th of July celebrations in cities and towns and hamlets throughout this United States of America. We will be reminded that our own country was born out of a struggle, an uprising against tyranny and oppression. We identify with the struggle of the Chinese people, who long for basic liberties that should be the birthright of every human being on the face of this earth. News reports out of Beijing tell us that the scene of the massacre today is quiet. We're here to say that we know what lies beneath the surface of that enforced silence. Threats, harassments, trials, and imprisonment of innocent people continue. How can the Bush administration, after making the decision to go to war to secure freedom for the people of Kuwait, now grant most favored nation status without condition to the government of China? How can we reconcile the barbaric acts of the Chinese government against its own people with our principle of freedom and democracy? I hope that the administration will rethink this misguided policy. Let us send a strong message to the people of China who still suffer in silence. We have not abandoned you. We stand with you in your struggle. Keep hope alive.
Our next speaker.
Nancy Pelosi's not going to speak now. She's going to wait.
Okay, and I'll introduce.
I want to. Before we introduce our next speaker, we just want to thank all the members who have spoken thus far. Congresswoman Pelosi will speak a little bit later on in the program, but I think it's very impressive the large turnout that we've had. And this document that's been signed by the members who have spoken today will now go to the floor of the Congress, where other members will have a chance to sign it. And the end of this week, it will be delivered to the Chinese embassy here in Washington. We now return to the printed program that some of you have a copy of, and Mr. John will introduce our next speaker.
You know, we gather here every year. Well, it's 2 years in a row. The students, there are, you know, it's said it's more than 40,000 Chinese students in this country, and about 100,000 students staying overseas. And some people say that, you know, you just can't look forward. You just cannot look ahead. You always look what happened 2 years ago. Now, I want to tell everyone that we are the generation of the future. It is we that who look ahead, look forward. That's why we have our organization, and in which that we can unite together, have our collective voice heard. And in that context, let me present the President of Independent Federation of Chinese Student Scholars, Dr. Chen Xingyu.
Thank you, John. Thank you, all the honorable congressional members. Today we are gathered here not like the people gathered in the east of Berlin celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not like the people gathered in Prague electing their democratic government. We are gathered here because we want to show to the world that we haven't forgotten the people died in Tiananmen for the cause of freedom and democracy in China. We are here to show our commitment for the fight for human rights and democracy. We are here because China is still under totalitarianism. Chinese people are still suffering under the Chinese government repression. We are here because we even don't know the number of our brothers and sisters who died in Tiananmen Square 2 years ago. We even don't know how many people afterward were detained and sentenced. We are here because people in China still have no freedom of speech, and the voice of America are continuously jammed. 2 years ago, the world desperately wanted to help the people who were peacefully protesting for a democratic reform in Beijing. 2 years later today, Chinese people desperately need the help from people living in a free world. We should continuously voice strongly for the release of political prisoners. We should continuously pressure the Chinese government to allow the human rights organizations and the lawyer organizations to visit the prisons. We should help the Chinese overseas democratic movement by assisting the pro-democracy organizations in the United States and elsewhere. We should help Chinese people to get access of information by strengthening and enhancing the broadcast of Voice of America and establishing a Radio Free China. We should condition most favored nation to China with measures of human rights improvement. There are many organizations and individuals and institutions have done great contributions on these areas. In recognition and appreciation of their effort, a Tiananmen Square Award has been established by the Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars. On behalf of the IFCSS, I hereby announce the presentation of the Tiananmen Square Award to the following organizations: Congressional Human Rights Caucus, Congressional Working Group on China, Congressional Campaign for Chinese Political Prisoners, Asian Watch, Amnesty International, Voice of America China Branch. Human rights have no border, democracy has no border. Together we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker this afternoon will be one of the student leaders of the pro-democracy movement in China, now a student in this country and also president of the Democracy for China Fund, Mr. Shen Tong.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I thank all the members of Congress who have been speaking here and come here, and the American people who expressed a deep concern about democracy and freedom for Chinese people. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. We're here not only to mourn, to commemorate people who died 2 years ago, my friends and colleagues, in Tiananmen Square, in downtown Beijing, and other major cities across China, but also to look forward for the future democratization for China. And this gathering is a time we should have this every year that will examine what we have done and what we're going to do in the future. The past 2 years, we have been demonstrating to Beijing authority and to the world that the exile movement, the exile pro-democracy Chinese political movement is indeed effective, and we can make a lot of difference in China. And by my colleagues and friends mentioned, by cooperating with the American Congress, we can, through issues like most favored nation status, as well as Radio Free China, which can bring hopes and uncensored information to the Chinese people, we can affect China's politics. We can promote the quicker process of democratization in China. When I was in Beijing 2 years ago, either in the planning meeting for the demonstration or marching to Tiananmen Square, or cooperating with workers, journalists, and other demonstrators, I feel strongly the energy and strength of my nation, of our Chinese people. Being in exile for 2 years, I feel even stronger about my Chineseness. There's a strong sense of energy. We understand the meaning of the tenacity, that silence is not cowardice and patience is not numbness. If we set up our mind on a goal, we'll eventually achieve it. Once there was an ancient saying in China that if heaven assign a mission to a person, he will first make the suffering of this person physically and mentally. And we are here in exile, as well as our friends and colleagues in China, taking this heavenly mission for the future of China. And I often feel the presence of my friends and Chinese people, that no matter where they are now, in labor camp or in classroom, in receiving re-education or real education, in prison or in their grave, in hiding or in exile, they're always with me, and they're always with us here today. And together we take this heavenly mission that we dream one day every student in every campus, every worker in every factory, every citizen in every village and every city across China will taste freedom. And we tasted briefly in Tiananmen Square 2 years ago, and I can tell you this taste is sweet. And this sweet taste of freedom is just first drop of a spring flood. Will one day cleanse away the stings of June 3rd and 4th, and will raise up a tall tree of democracy and freedom from the heart of nonviolence, from the heart of a transformed Chinese nation. Thank you. Our next speaker will be a representative from Amnesty International, Louisa Cohen.
Two years ago today, I was a student in China. 2年以前，我就在中国。那个时候，我在中国已经待了2年。Before June 4th, 1989, I was not involved in the international effort to end human rights abuses in China. I recognized, of course, that people in China were afraid to say publicly what they really thought about their leadership. But I did not concern myself with the widespread abuses, the routine use of torture in Chinese detention centers, the lack of due process rights in the court system, or the fate of those who had dared to participate in the 1979 Democracy Wall movement. After June 4th, 1989, I could no longer ignore the human rights abuses in China. Wei Jingsheng is the best known of the Democracy Wall protesters still in jail. In 1979, Wei Jingsheng was 29 years old. That year, he was sentenced to 15 years for counter-revolutionary activities. Wei Jingsheng was an electrician at the Beijing Zoo who had written wall posters and articles criticizing the political system in China and advocating democracy. His trial prompted an international outcry. Deng Xiaoping's response to that international furor, distributed in a Communist Party document, has become infamous. "We put Wei Jingsheng in jail," he said, "and it didn't hurt us at all." The presence of everyone here today and in cities around the world gives the lie to Deng's statement. The world has not forgotten Wei Jingsheng and the 1979 Democracy Wall protesters. The world has not forgotten the Catholic priests and Protestant ministers and the Buddhist monks and nuns imprisoned because of their religious practices. The world has not forgotten the Tibetan nationalists who have been imprisoned, tortured, and killed. The world has not forgotten Chen Ziming, Wang Juntao, and the thousands of other pro-democracy demonstrators who languish in Chinese jails and prison camps. Since returning from China, I have come to realize that each of us can make a difference in the struggle to end human rights abuses in China. The Chinese government has shown that it is vulnerable to international pressure. Fang Lizhi is free and here with us today. Han Dongfang, the leading labor union organizer from Beijing, was recently released. Zhang Weiguo, the lawyer and journalist, has also been released, as have many others, in part because of international pressure. But the Chinese leaders are very patient. They still believe that the world will forget what happened on June 4th, 1989. We need to keep sending the message over and over, year in and year out, that we will never forget what happened in Tiananmen Square and in the streets of Beijing. Members of Congress need continuously to monitor the human rights practices in China and to criticize any and all abuses. Professional associations and business people need to keep bringing up human rights issues whenever they visit China or receive delegations from China in the U.S. But members of Congress need your help in their effort to convince the Chinese leadership that concerns about human rights abuses will not go away. You need to keep telling your senators and representatives, and you need to keep telling the President that concern about human rights in China and in every country should be a fundamental component of U.S. foreign policy. 不管我们是谁，作为一个人，都应该勇敢地站出来，为中国的人权大声疾呼。It is the responsibility of all of us to keep speaking out long enough and loud enough until Deng Xiaoping comes to realize how wrong he was when he said the world would not remember and it would not matter. The Chinese people have been appealing to their government to respect their rights. We add our voices to that appeal. We urge the Chinese government to heed that plea.
all of us who have tried to follow the events in the wake of the pro-democracy movement and the crackdown of 1989 have relied on the reports of Amnesty International, for whom Louisa Cohen just spoke, and another organization whose leader will speak next on our program. It's a pleasure to introduce Robert Bernstein, the chairman of the board of Asia Watch, whose organization, along with Amnesty and other human rights monitoring organizations, have provided us and continue to provide us the most important, objective, factual information about the continuing problems with human rights in China. Mr. Bernstein.
As we all know, 2 years ago today, a group of Chinese students, workers, and ordinary citizens gathered in Tiananmen Square to deliver a message to a totalitarian government. The government of China chose not to hear this message, and that's why we are here today. Its government should be ashamed that a meeting like this one cannot occur in China. It should really be ashamed that Fang Lizhi, who's standing right over there, a man that any decent country would be proud of, not only had to flee his country, but is on a list of the most wanted criminals. It's really ludicrous. Should be most ashamed that men and women devoted to improving their country and have committed no criminal act except to make their ideas known are in jails and being tortured. You've just heard about Wei Jishang, who's not only in jail, but has reportedly been in solitary confinement for 12 years, and reportedly that his punishment is being monitored by Deng Xiaoping. I suggest to you that this is mind-boggling. 2 other men, Xu Wenli, X-U, W-E-N-L-I, and Wang Xizhe, X-I-Z-H-E, have also reportedly been in solitary confinement for over 10 years. Chen Ziming and Wang Juntou have just been sentenced to 13 years, as we know. A letter from Wang's wife, Ho Xiaotian, to the United States Human Rights Commission in Geneva said, "The Chinese government is treating these political prisoners with the utmost cruelty, completely taking away their freedom, taking away their basic rights, and breaking their spirits. How can this be reformed through labor? This is complete political impression." I'm honored to have been asked as an American to speak here. If I was speaking directly to the Chinese government, this is what I would say to them. Who are we? Some of us are not the United States government. We're just plain American citizens who believe the world cannot evolve into a better place without more government attention by all governments to human rights. We do not wish to interfere in the internal affairs in China. Our own country has plenty of internal problems for us to help set right. Poverty, homelessness, drugs, to mention a few. However, we do want to be sure that Chinese citizens are free to participate in the government of China, and we want to help them get this right for our benefit as well as theirs. Americans in the promulgation of human rights ideas understand that it is not enough any longer to have human rights at home. We've just fought a war with Iraq, a war that was caused a lot by our government overlooking human rights for what they thought were more important advantages. They were wrong. The way governments observe human rights in their own countries is a very good barometer as to how they will act in the international arena. As some of you know, a new committee has been formed. It is called the Committee to End the Chinese Gulag. Its chairs are Fang Lizhi, Liu Binyan, Yuri Orlov, Adam Michnik, Cyrus Vance, and myself. A group of prominent Americans and citizens of other countries are rapidly joining, as are whole organizations of scientists, journalists, and others. A cross-section of North America, Europe, and Asia. People who disagree on many things, but agree that China, to enter the community of nations, must end its gulag, which not only ruins the lives of millions, but stands as a warning to over 1 billion human beings that they are not free to speak. Isn't it strange that when we started this committee, we did not know that this gulag was engaged in making products for export, holding political prisoners arbitrarily after their terms have expired, in order to use them to manufacture products for export, textiles, electronics, and even agricultural products like tea. How ironic that this communist government, dedicated to the idea that all people are created equal, are the very ones to undermine the workers of the world they profess to care about. We will not know the extent of this gulag until independent journalists like Liu Binyan are allowed to visit the camps all over China and dig out the true story. Here's what our committee will do. We'll try to bring more and more attention to the unjust legal system of this great nation, China. Asia Watch, as you've heard, has compiled a list of over 1,100 names imprisoned because of Tiananmen. We all know that this is only a fraction. We will try and have this list come up at every international meeting until these people are free and free to speak. We will try and see that the Chinese government does not send its lackeys to international meetings. We will try to make sure that if meetings like the 21st International Conference on the Physics of Semiconductors, scheduled for 1992 in Beijing, takes place there, that human rights and the prisoners of Tiananmen are an integral part of the business of the meeting. Scientists, physicists particularly, have been among the most effective fighters for human rights, and I am sure they will explore the matter thoroughly before asking 2,000 to 3,000 physicists to go to Beijing in 1992. Asia Watch is not in a position to endorse any particular legislative approach, but we insist that measurable, effective, and meaningful human rights conditions be clearly spelled out in law if MFN is extended this year. Congress must be committed to ending MFN if those improvements are not made within a specified time frame. The condition should include a prompt accounting for all those detained, demonstrable progress toward releasing all political prisoners in China and Tibet, an end to the export of goods made by prison labor, the opening up of labor camps for international inspection, and concrete measures taken to end torture. Before MFN is extended, China's leaders should be asked to commit themselves to meeting these conditions by specified dates. If MFN is revoked, the moves needed to get it back should be clearly spelled out. There will be meetings like this a year from today, but Tiananmen Square will be remembered a long time. Let us hope that one of the meetings will be of free Chinese gathered peacefully in Tiananmen or wherever they wish, instead of in exile in the United States. Thank you. I have great pleasure to introduce to you the next speaker, Liu Jinghua. She is a founder of the first independent trade union in China, the Beijing Workers' Autonomous Federation. She was in Tiananmen Square in charge of the union's broadcast station. Her name appeared on the Chinese government's most wanted list, one of 4 women on the list. After months of fleeing and hiding, she arrived in the U.S. at the end of 1989 and was given political asylum. She was forced to leave behind her husband and infant daughter. She speaks today on behalf of herself and the thousands of workers across China who remain in jail or in labor camps. I just want to add one thing. MFN says that there should be free immigration, and that if there is not free immigration, that automatically there should be no MFN. As you think of her husband and child in China, that's something to remember. Liu Jinghua.
Welcome, friends. How are you? Today, my heart is touched and very saddened. But I feel that my heart is touched and saddened in the same way as many of yours.
我呢是由于参加了1989年的工人运动。
Because I participated in the 1989 workers' movement.
被中国共产党通缉，然后逃亡到美国。
I was persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party and forced to flee to the United States.
我今天呢是已经来到那个华盛顿呢，是来有4、5次了。
This is the 4th or 5th time since I've come to the United States that I've come here to Washington.
但是面对着我们这么多的观众，我还是第一次。
But this is the first time I've been able to reach so large an audience.
我每一次来呢，我都跟大家讲一讲北京工字联当时发生的情况。
Every time I come, I speak about the situation and the origins of the Chinese workers' movement.
我想呢，今天呢，对着大家呢，我还是想讲一句：工字联自从成立这组织以来，自始至终就是合理、合法、合乎现有的宪法。
And I think that I should come here again today to reiterate how important and lawful and in keeping with the Chinese Constitution was the formation of the independent Chinese Federation of Workers.
但是在64以后呢，那个中共当局呢逮捕了好多工人，还有许多市民，然后对他们的处刑呢是非常的严重的，非常残酷的。
Yet, after the crackdown on June 4th of 1989, the Chinese Communist Party and government have persecuted these workers, arrested them, and subjected them to the very severest punishments.
所以今天呢，在这个64 2周年的今天，我想呢跟大家讲一讲我们这些普普通通的市民，还有那些毫无名气的工人们。
So today, on the anniversary of that June 4th, I want to speak to you briefly about the situation of the average citizens of Beijing and the workers who form that movement.
我想没有他们这些人的参与，1989年的民主运动是很难坚持下来的。
I think that if it were not for their participation and organization of that movement, the movement would not have been so well organized and would not still be with us here today.
面对这么多的这熟悉的面孔呢，我今天还是想讲一句，就说我今天看到了你们，我第一是心情十分的激动。
And I want to state how very moved I am that so many people have turned out here today to commemorate those events.
使我对民主、自由、人权的向往和在中国的实现，我更加充满了信心。
And I still have great hope and belief in the final, eventual construction of a democratic China.
众所周知的是，在1个月前的今天，韩东方就是我们工字联的领导人。
Just a little over a month before today, our leader of the workers' movement, Han Dongfang, was finally freed from jail.
被中共当局呢释放出狱，其中有一条原因。
And the reason why he was finally freed from jail is singular.
有一个原因，就是因为我们海外的华人和我们这些爱好和平、爱好自由、爱好人权的人们的团结所给予的这个结果。
It's because of those efforts of overseas Chinese and all others who love freedom and democracy and justice who have exerted themselves on behalf of him, who have had him freed from that Chinese jail.
我呢在这里呢衷心的感谢大家对我们这些人的支持，谢谢你们。
And I want to thank you all for your great support of this fighter for freedom.
谢谢 ，Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Congressman Barney Frank from Massachusetts.
Thank you. I appreciate your letting me speak now. The House, as we stand here, is voting on civil rights. Nancy Pelosi just had to leave to cast her vote. It would be a source of grave embarrassment, I think, for our country, for us to devote the time we are devoting to vindicating human rights here at home and to ignore our responsibility to fight for human rights abroad. Obviously, we cannot expect to have outside our own country's borders the kind of influence we have inside. But if we are not guaranteed to succeed in the effort to promote human rights all over the world, we are obligated to try. For us to grant most favored nation treatment to the People's Republic of China now with no conditions would be as stunning a repudiation of this nation's tradition of concern for human rights as any else I can think of. If we are not to render our own professions totally hypocritical, we owe it to ourselves to continue the fight and specifically to use the vehicle of most favored nation legislation to do it. There simply is no way we can, as a nation, make a case for the action we took with regard to Kuwait and then say, but when it comes to the people of China, when it comes to that large nation and large population, none of the human rights rules that we talked about apply. I want to express my admiration to so many of you here who have put yourselves at grave risk to fight for human rights, and I want to express my appreciation as an American for your giving us a chance to remain true to what many of us believe are this country's most important principles. It is a pleasure and an honor to be linked with so many genuine heroes in the fight for human rights. And you can be sure that under the leadership of people like Congresswoman Pelosi, many of us are determined to do everything that is within our power to see that freedom comes to the people of China. Thank you.
Our next speaker is one of the leaders of that large group of overseas Chinese from the many various parts that make up the constituency of Greater China, of which many overseas Chinese here in the United States are a part. San Zhang of the Federation of Overseas Hong Kong Chinese, an organization based here in Washington, D.C. and founded in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square, will speak for those overseas compatriots from Hong Kong, but part of them Taiwan, Singapore, and further flung reaches even here in Washington, D.C., many of whom have joined with their brothers and sisters inside the People's Republic of China to fight for freedom.
Two years ago, when Chinese students gathered at Tiananmen Square to appeal for basic freedoms and an end to governmental corruption, 1 million people marched in Hong Kong in a show of support. For the citizens of Hong Kong longed to be reunited with a China in which fundamental human rights would be respected. We never dreamed that only a few short weeks later we would take to the streets once more, this time in fury. Because in one endless night of carnage on June 4th, the Beijing government savagely crushed the democratic movement. We wept with our brothers and sisters. 2 years later, many have become disheartened by an unyielding Chinese government that continues to suppress dissent and to hold prisoners of conscience. But we assure you that the June 4th movement had not been waged in vain, for the drama which unfolded at Tiananmen unleashed in us a sense of patriotism never felt before. The hope for a new China, inspired by the unflinching optimism of the students, live on in our hearts. The senseless massacre served only to strengthen our resolve. We are confident that history will pass fair judgment on the episode at Tiananmen. On this solemn occasion, we ask our American friends to join us in a moment's remembrance of the students who inspired us by boldly reciting Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death," and in the end received violent death.
Our next speaker will be Miranda Shen, because I know her
name is Yan Xiaomei, the president of the Greater Washington Network for China Democracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Miranda Xie. I am representing the Greater Washington Network for Chinese Democracy. We are Chinese Americans who are deeply concerned about the human rights and democratic movements in China. We have been and we will be working with Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars in support of such movements. Like all of you, we were shocked by the brutal killings of its own people by the Chinese government at Tiananmen Square 2 years ago. Like most of you, we deeply regret that President Bush, after reviewing Chinese government's poor human rights records, still decided to grant MFN trade status unconditionally. America is a great nation, and we are proud to be part of it. We are proud that this country is a leader in sciences and technologies, and we are especially proud that this country has high moral standards. However, we find ourselves not be able to claim we are moral in being over-lenient toward human rights violations. We urge the Congress to impose human rights conditions on the renewal of China's MFN trade status. We believe President Bush means well by not isolating China. However, the attachment of human rights conditions would better serve whatever is left out by the President's policy. We also call upon the Chinese leaders to repent and reform now, and the whole world will applaud. The time is now. Let the great engine of freedom and democracy transform China into a land of political equality and economic prosperity. Thank you.
While we wait for Congresswoman Pelosi to return from her floor vote to introduce our final speaker, Professor Fang-Li Zhi, we will return to an entertainment part of our program that was originally cut short. Two guitarists in the group of Comet and Prison Earth will perform. They have prepared a musical program and actually recorded a tape in memory of the event in Tiananmen Square, which I am holding here in my hand. And they will set up to begin as quickly as we can arrange it. As soon as Congresswoman Pelosi returns from the floor vote, she will introduce our final speaker after speaking herself, and you will hear from Professor Fang-Li Zhi. Thank you for your patience and your attention.
We are very honored to be here in the name of the defenders of Beijing. When we first saw the reports on the news, we became incensed and wrote the song, and they've allowed us to come to a lot of demonstrations, and we're really happy to be here. This is the song we wrote, if you can hear us. We couldn't get electricity. It's called Tiananmen. See the masses in the square all came out, but now there's no one there. They're flamethrowers and on the cars had no mercy, and it's gone too far. I don't wanna see you all alone, but all I have to offer is my song. Tiananmen, can't imagine. Tiananmen, can't imagine. All the nations are standing by, watching murder while a billion war cries. Just some freedom for the day, till the leaders come and take it all away. I don't wanna hear you giving in, but all I have to offer is my pen. Gentlemen, can't imagine. Gentlemen, can't imagine. 可能广场上的人民，多一粒就现在住一人，何等是但装甲奔驰，找不人的人能容忍，我不愿见你们会这样做。等我所能给的只是这个。Gentlemen, can't imagine. Gentlemen, can't imagine. 随着国痛刚赴约，目的之下是为人民的日月，只有时光它坏一线，杀气航行无人这满天，我不愿你们起步，等我所能给的只是我的笔。Gentlemen, can't imagine. Gentlemen, can't imagine. Gentlemen, can't imagine.
Is the speaker here yet? Yeah, he's here.
Thank you very much, and please keep the dream and hope for freedom in China alive. Please, thank you.
Can we have another hand for Common and Prison Earth? Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi from California. The one of the few names that the Chinese students are most familiar with. In the field of human rights, Congresswoman Pelosi has championed the cause of democracy in China, introducing the legislation to protect Chinese students from forcible return to China after Tiananmen Square massacre. She also introduced the legislation conditioning most favored nations trade status to China on improvement in the treatment of the citizens of the People's Republic of China. Let me present Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much. Where's our mic? Which one? This one? This one? Oh, that one. Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your kind words and your warm welcome. It's indeed a pleasure. I shouldn't say a pleasure, but I'm glad to be here with you. It would be a pleasure if we had the prisoners freed and a more democratic China. But we are here to speak for the Chinese people silenced by their own government. On this second anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, we stood this morning at the Chinese embassy to say that the spirit of democracy that so captivated the world in 1989 has not been crushed. We say to the Chinese government that despite its predictions about the West's memory, we have not forgotten. We stand here today with those pro-democracy demonstrators who continue to suffer, working in prison labor camps or forced by exile to remain separated from their families and friends. And most of all, we stand here with the mothers and fathers who lost their children under the crush of tanks or the fire of bullets. After the massacre of their children, the Chinese government awarded commemorative watches to those who did the killing. Well, I have a copy of one of those watches. This is an actual watch that was given by the Chinese Communist Party to each of the soldiers who participated in the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. This watch was smuggled out of China, and it was presented to me at a rally in San Francisco over the weekend where we were observing the 2-year anniversary of the brutal repression and massacre in Tiananmen Square. And what this watch says is that time is running out for the regressive regime in China. What this watch says to the butchers of Beijing is that you are yesterday, and the young people who demonstrated in Tiananmen Square are tomorrow. Time is running out for the butchers of Beijing because what is inconceivable to them is inevitable to those who fought and risked their lives, and some gave their lives for democratic reform in China. Earlier today, as I mentioned, we were at the Chinese embassy. We were there to commemorate the 2-year anniversary, as I mentioned, and we were also there, a bipartisan group of members of Congress, to deliver a letter to the ambassador to express our continuing concern about the fate of those who were imprisoned for their nonviolent activities in Tiananmen Square. We had a peaceful, dignified, solemn commemoration in front of the embassy, and then we went to the embassy to deliver this letter. Unfortunately, I must report to you, and you may already know, that the ambassador was too busy to see us. But worse than that, the person he assigned to greet us was not authorized to receive any letters today. The ambassador didn't have time, and his person was not authorized to receive the letter. That was very unfortunate, because while we look forward to a brilliant future with China, brilliant economically, politically, diplomatically, culturally, there are those who would say that we are trying to isolate China. That couldn't be farther from the truth. But China is trying to isolate itself, unfortunately, by the repression of its people. And there's no greater proof than the fact that they would not even receive a letter from the members of Congress who had come to them, hopefully to improve communication about just what our conditions were for renewal of most favored nation. When I leave here today, I just ran to the floor because I had to vote. And while I was up there, because we're engaged in the civil rights debate, I received the greetings of so many of my colleagues to extend to you, that those of us who did appear here speak not only for ourselves, but hundreds of members of Congress. And they asked me to bring this scroll back to the Capitol so that inside the House of Representatives chambers, they could affix their signatures to this scroll. So much has been said about what has happened in the past. For the past 2 years, it's been a tragic thing, and the repression continues. As we prepared for this anniversary, the government in Beijing, as you know, continued and increased its repression and threatened those not only who participated in any pro-democracy activities, but those who were even aware of any and did not report them, threatened them with imprisonment. As we prepared for this 2-year anniversary, many of us worked together to formulate a way to send a message to China. Unfortunately, the administration in the White House has prepared for this anniversary by announcing the extension of most favored nation status to China unconditionally. I don't think the Chinese government deserves a 2-year anniversary for slaughtering its young people in Tiananmen Square. And so we don't want the President to give this anniversary present of $15 billion in trade advantages and preferential treatment. Instead, as the rest of us have been preparing legislation to put reasonable conditions on that renewal, renew it for this year, reasonable conditions. If they're not met, there can be no renewal of MFN next year. But among those reasonable conditions, we're asking for progress in terms of human rights, but we must insist upon freeing the prisoners who were arrested because of pro-democratic activities surrounding Tiananmen Square and before and since. So I hope that I call on you to work with us for that. We have over 130 members of Congress already signed on as co-sponsors of that legislation. We need more. We need your help. I hope you'll stay around today after these activities and work the halls of Congress by asking people to not only sign the scroll, but sign up for the bill. Today I have a particular privilege, and I consider it, and when you're in politics, and especially being a member of Congress representing a magnificent place, San Francisco in the Congress, you have many great honors in your life. But I would say that certainly not surpassed is the privilege that I have today to introduce to you a true hero, a true champion of democracy, not only for now, but for all history. You know about Professor Fang Leger. I don't have to tell you the particulars about him, but I will tell you a little bit about him. I will tell you that 2 years ago, right after the massacre, when we were in Boston meeting with hundreds of students from all over the country to talk about a strategy on how we would protect the Chinese students in America, I said to the students, would it make a difference if Professor Fang were with us today? You know these students, they're all very bright, they have millions of ideas, very energetic and active, and for all these hundreds of students with all their activity and energy and ideas, for the first time, I have to say, students, a hush fell over the crowd. This usually vibrant, active group was silent. Oh yes, they said, that would make all the difference in the world. Professor Fang is an inspiration to us because of what he says and because of the courage he has demonstrated for what he believes in. Oh yes, that would make a great difference because we all believe in what Professor Fang has to say and what he has done. That would make a tremendous difference if Professor Fang were with us. I didn't know Professor Fang at the time. I had only read about and admired his courage, but I was very, very impressed by what the students had to say, and I can't think of any way to enlarge on the sincerity and the enthusiasm that the Chinese students in America had to talk about Professor Fang. Courageous, inspirational, a leader. Please welcome Professor Fang Leger.
Thank you. Please allow me to speak in Chinese because Voice of American want to boycott my voice directly to China. 首先，我代表所有我的朋友和同学，以及很多追求民主的中国人，感谢今天在这里发表言论支持中国民主和人权运动的美国国会议员以及其他各界的朋友们。
First, I want to bring you the thanks of many of my comrades, colleagues, co-workers in the struggle for democracy, to this audience and to the many members of Congress who have spoken up so strongly for the cause of democracy in China.
今天我只准备讲一个意见，就是说，大家对中国民主的关心，对中国民主的支持，是会收到效果的。
And today, I'm here to express one single opinion, and that is that your support, your turnout here today for democracy in China is definitely effective.
我只想说，首先说一点，我记得2年前的今天，我在家里，很多朋友到了我家里，劝我们赶快离开。那时候大家都处在恐怖之中。1年以前，我还在北京的美国大使馆，没有太阳的屋子里面，看在全世界各地的这种新闻。今天 我就能够站在这里向大家发表演说。我想这个变化就是证明大家的支持、大家的帮助是有效果的。
The very fact that 2 years ago to this day I had to flee from my home and then spend over a year in a dark, windowless room in the American Embassy in Beijing before I was finally able to come here and speak before you, that one very fact shows just how much effect your work and your support has had.
所以，我希望更多的人来加入我们的工作。正像刚才南希·普鲁西说的，加入这种推动民主运动，我们会得到更多的效果，使更多的人获得自由。
And I can only hope that many more will enter into this work, the very kind of work that Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi has undertaken for so long, that can redouble and increase the efforts and the effectiveness that our work for freedom can have.
有的人看到中国的当局现在用警察、用军队来控制中国，觉得中国好像改变的希望很小。我要说，正好相反。现在他之所以用军队、用警察来控制，正说明他的虚弱。
Many people look at the kind of controls the party center has had to place on China, using the police and the military to enforce their rule, and say that China today looks hopeless. But I think it's just the reverse. The very fact that they've had to rely on the party and the police and the military to do their dirty work shows just how weak and rotten they are.
大家可能看到今天的报纸上登了一张照片，那张照片上，大家注意，今天的天安门广场并没有学生，也没有知识分子，也没有工人在游行，只是有一些曾经在2年前沾染过民主的空气，现在当局连沾染过民主的空气都害怕。
And if you look at the pictures that have appeared in the paper over the last day or two that show an empty Tiananmen Square surrounded by rings of police, you can see just how empty it is. Empty of the very kind of spirit of democracy that so filled it 2 years ago to this day. And keep that emptiness of today's Tiananmen Square ringed by policemen in mind, contrast it, compare it to the spirit of democracy that pervaded it 2 years ago.
当然，今天天安门没有游行，没有示威，并不是说中国人已经放弃了民主，不是，相反，中国的朋友、中国的同事仍然在很艰苦的环境里面坚持民主的要求、人权的要求。
And if Tiananmen Square today is lacking those intellectuals and students and workers who filled it those years ago, I think it's important to remember that there are many more here and elsewhere who are still carrying on the fight for Chinese freedom and democracy.
我只愿意说一个例子。最近我刚得到一个信息，中国的著名作家王若望前不久就在近期传过来一个信息，他告诉我们一条，他写的是：此间人心思变之温度正在上升，敢于为人权民主而献身者大有人在。
And here I quote from a famous writer who, along with Professor Fang, was also expelled from the Communist Party, Mr. Wang Ruowang, who pointed out in one of his writings that it's just before this point, particularly the point where one is brought almost to death for fighting for what one cares for, that shows just how important these struggles are.
我现在趁这个机会，要告诉我们的朋友，在国内的朋友，像王若望先生以及其他追求民主的朋友说，在国外，在中国之外，关心中国民主、关心中国人权、关心中国自由、关心中国发展的各界人士，也是大有人在。
And I want to give this message to any of the listeners who are hearing this in China, and particularly to Mr. Wang Rowang, about the large number of people here and all over the world who care about freedom in China, who care about democracy in China, who care about human rights and development in China. They are enormous indeed.
自由的概念是朴实的，追求自由是没有边界的；人权的概念也是朴实的，追求人权也是没有国界的。因此，国内、国外，凡是关心中国进步的人，大家联起手来，推动中国的发展。我相信，在不久的将来，中国也一定会进入民主、发达、人权这种国家的行列。谢谢。
Freedom is universal. It knows no borders. And the desire for human rights, that is a universal too. And it has no limits. And I know that with the help of the many people who are gathered here, the people around the world who have fought for this issue, that in not too short a time, henceforward, we will be able to enjoy the fruits of this struggle, freedom, democracy, and liberty, along with development and everything that we hope for the future of China. Let me express the gratitude of all the members who spoke here today, the other speakers on our program, and I'll speak for myself and let my fellow Master of Ceremonies speak in a moment. For all of you, your attention, but more importantly, your commitment to this cause of freedom and human rights in China. This is the second anniversary of a very sad event for all of us, but we hope that in the not too far future, as Professor Fang has said, that we'll finally be able to enter into that period of freedom, human rights, and greater liberty in China. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming. I just want to make one announcement before I call this rally over. There is a candlelight vigil tonight at 8 o'clock in front of Chinese Embassy. The address, the best I can remember, it's 2300 Connecticut Avenue. And there will be a candlelight vigil, and also there will be open letter delivery, both from a group of Chinese dissidents and students. I guess the letter was circulated around here, and also a letter was addressed to the chairman of National People's Congress, Mr. Wan Li, was co-signed by more than 1,000 Chinese students around the country in the United States. So I would like you, I invite you to join us in the candlelight vigil tonight at 8 in front of Chinese Embassy. And please get together and walk into the corridor of... want to speak? Yeah.
Please don't forget to direct all of your concern for China now by walking the halls of Congress, visiting members of Congress, the House and the Senate, and asking them to put their concern to work by supporting legislation conditioning renewal of most favored nation in China. On behalf of my colleagues, I thank you all for being here too. Thank you.
A note that both houses of Congress have introduced resolutions to block the extension of most favored nation trading status for China. The issue should come before the House and Senate sometime in the next few weeks and must be decided on before 90 days. We'll take a break now for a look at the schedule.